I do feel like there's been a lot of movement, but now with this pushback, there's a great deal of ESG in the news and a lot what I would call disinformation about what it is and what it isn't. And therefore, I think what we're doing today in this panel is really important to help articulate and assess what does it mean.
Hi there, and welcome to Voices from the Institute for Human Rights in Business, also known as IHRB. I am Deborah Sager, and in this podcast, you will hear from people working to make respect for human rights part of everyday business. You've just heard from David Schilling, who's from the Interfaith Centre on Corporate Responsibility, ICCR. The ICCR is a coalition of investors who believe that corporations need to look further than just their financial performance to consider the full impact of their businesses on society. One way of measuring that impact is through ESG metrics, environmental, social, and governance factors. ESG has been around for some time now, evolving through different names. But more recently, there's been a backlash to it, most notably in the United States. My colleague Salil Tripathi spoke to David about this, and also to Vasuki Shastry, who's the author of a book called Notorious ESG. Coming up, you're going to hear more about that backlash from them. You're also going to hear about David's long and distinguished career. Salil's with me now. Salil, tell me more about David. He's been involved with business and human rights for a long time, hasn't he?
Oh, yes, he has been. He has been privileged enough to have, known and worked with people such as Robert Kennedy. He has got to know Bishop Desmond Tutu of South Africa, who was one of the founders and leaders of the anti-apartheid movement, as well as with the Chavez and the whole United Farm Workers movement in America. And those of us at IHRB who have worked on issues of migrant labor, you go to Dhaka in Bangladesh and people know him because he's been involved with the Dhaka principles and what the garment workers in Bangladesh have suffered.
What kind of investors are interested in ESG?
We often talk about investors, and there are straightforward investors who are investors in the market and they only look at the bottom line and they only look at price-earning ratios. And then there are the ethical investors and responsible investors. There is a connection between ESG as a concept and what investors and investment community want out of it. And those ethical and responsible investors do need criteria by which they can evaluate companies. And one of the criteria that they want to look at is this whole notion of ESG, environmental, social, and governance indicators. And that exactly is the reason why the more market-driven investors feel that this brings in woke capitalism and, a kind of an externality which detracts a company from meeting its fiduciary responsibilities.
Vasuki also has expert insight into this. Why bring them both together?
Well, Vasuki is quite an interesting example of experiences that he has had. He has been working with a central bank in Singapore. He has been a journalist in Indonesia and India. He speaks several Asian languages. And he has also worked with the International Monetary Fund as a public affairs person and with a large British bank. So he knows how international finance works. He knows how markets work. And he is a keen observer of capitalism and its impact on society. And he's very concerned about the ethical dimensions of it, and which is one reason why he wrote this book, which he looked and examined and took apart the whole notion of ESG and why it has become such an important issue.
Thank you, Salil. Let's hear your discussion now, starting off with David, who can give us some of the history of ESG.
Environmental social governance issues were dealt with from the beginning of shareholder engagement. They got really institutionalized in 2005, 2006. Kofi Annan, of course, had reached out to get a group to work on what became the UN PRI. And ICCR was part of that larger. There was a group of about 70 that were advisors. And so a lot of different perspectives. But you basically have those 6 frameworks that are pretty general. And they're voluntary, of course, but that is where I think ESG solidified and then became a way of large investors and small looking at how do we mitigate risk in our portfolios. and looking at it through a lens not just of, the economic issues, although that's important, this social, environmental, human rights, governance. And I think always for us, we've spent more time working on social sustainability, a lot on environment, no question, but you can't do anything without trying to address governance. So I think it is a whole piece, and it's come a long ways. I'm always a little concerned when we think we have the right formula that's going to take care of everything, and that's not the case. There are many different approaches, even under ESG, and the one that we probably support is really when large investors and small take the environmental social governance framework and not just put it into their marketing, but into their how they make the investments in their portfolios. So I do feel like there's been a lot of movement, but now with this pushback, there's a great deal of ESG in the news and a lot what I would call disinformation about what it is and what it isn't. And therefore, I think what we're doing today in this panel is really important to help articulate and assess. What does it mean?
Yeah, and to make some sense of that, I want to bring in my friend and one of the advisors on the advisory board of the Institute, Vasuki. He recently wrote a book on ESG and what it means. So tell us a little bit about your book, Vasu, but also if you can also tell us about why this backlash that has been emerging and what are the consequences of that.
Thanks a lot for having me, Salil. And David, it's a real privilege to be on the same panel with you. And I think we should all agree, as David pointed out, ESG is not a new construct. It's been with us for several decades. What we have on an ongoing basis these past few decades is what has been described, I think, appropriately as input ESG. These are a list of metrics, commitments by companies across human rights, across environmental management, across social protection. I don't think that is going away. The real problem is in so-called ESG output, which is really ESG as an investing class. And so you've had this remarkable 5-year, 6-year journey where trillions of dollars have been raised by diverse group of companies, asset managers, financial institutions, all labeling their proposition as being ESG funds. And I think it is the ESG fund phenomenon which in many ways has created this backlash. Because you've got on one hand the political backlash, mainly of course epicenter is here in the US, where a lot of politicians feel these asset manager corporate mandates, for example, improving diversity, in driving corporate inclusion. I mean, they've mislabeled it as being woke, but I think it's useful to focus on investors who are losing money, putting money into these ESG funds, and then suddenly realizing that companies are making a series of either blatantly false commitments that the products that they're selling are fully ESG compliant, or on the other hand, there's a great deal of ambiguity because we don't have global rules of the road. And we probably do have in terms of climate change through the Task Force for Climate-Related Disclosures. But there's regulatory confusion. So where we are today is you've got the political backlash. The investors have become very skeptical. There's lack of comparability, lack of adequate regulation. And maybe in many ways, this backlash could have been predicted because of the sheer hype and hysteria which we saw in the last few years.
So I'm still struggling with one part, which is the causes of the backlash. And let me explain why. Because, when the Silicon Valley Bank, for example, collapsed, some of the market-leaning or right-wing critics said it's all because they were doing woke things like DEI. But then if you look at BlackRock, even companies like Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan, they have even more of a commitment to the very same criteria that they were attacking Silicon Valley Bank about. So what I'm trying to understand, to what extent is this entirely a part of cultural wars within the United States as a political backlash, and to what extent it is understood? Because they talk in terms of a language where they say that the investors and the trustees are being disloyal. They're supposed to earn a great return, but instead they are doing all these nice things because their children and grandchildren are going out and marching for climate. But that's not what they should be doing. They should be increasing the reward and let then the dividend getters decide what they want to do with their money. So I just want you to unpack the bit to understand the causes.
I think you sketched it out very, very nicely, that you've got this sense that by better compliance, greater commitment, for example, on diversity, companies are getting distracted. First, I think there's no evidence of this. I mean, this is just a blatant, misguided missile, in my view, which is not backed up by the facts. And I think if you ask corporate leaders here in the US, they've kind of moved on. Because if you're inside a major bank or a corporate entity today, you know your corporate leadership recognizes that diversity and inclusion is an integral building block of the way you do business. Right? So there's this political backlash, and I think corporate leaders are very wisely tuning out from the politics. I mean, this is going to be, I think, the issue for 2024. And where I hope we're going to end up in 2025 is a more resolute focus on evidence to build up this ESG case better. And, we've got to admit the evidence has been shaky in terms of metrics.
David, your thoughts? Yes.
I think if you look at what ICCR is facing and other organizations that are still engaging companies, and our response, I think, in part, is to clarify what the data is, but also to really keep working with companies to address some of the core systemic issues that they can't really turn their back on, whether it's climate risk, whether it's income and wealth disparity, whether it's the retention of top talent, where so many of the studies I've looked at, if you look at the ESG, and there's so many different types, right? But if you really look at how that is embedded into a business, it's not going to be unembedded. And in part, we need to think about what's been happening in Europe that impacts U.S. companies with the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive.
I did want to ask about the voluntary and mandatory nature of these guidances that are coming out. And it's a very old debate within the human rights and business community, whether something is voluntary or mandatory.
So I do feel like we as an organization are moving towards clearly the voluntary, if that means innovation and you're really trying to move beyond the legal compliance. But we really feel like the mandatory is so important, and that's why we've been following the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. We personally, as an organization, wanted the financial sector, including investors, to be included. And if we remember some of the data that emerged as the process got started in Europe, that there are 750 companies that were involved in looking at the whole range of voluntary, mandatory. And one of the top issues was, let's get a common playing field. That you really need mandatory, across-the-board regulation. And hopefully it's smart regulation that really takes into account all the various human rights issues that workers and communities and suppliers and that companies face within their own operations.
So Vasuki, you have a very interesting vantage point here, because you've been at the IMF, which is a global lender of last resort, or at least someone who helps fix things together when things go wrong. You've been with a central bank in Singapore, and you've been with a very large bank in England. And you are also at the same time in a sector which is an enabler of economic activity. A bank doesn't set up a power plant, but it makes sure that a power plant gets built. And as David was pointing out, there was considerable resistance from the financial sector to be included in this due diligence reporting. At the same time, the wise bankers do believe that this is a necessary thing. How do you see this tension play out, and how can that be sorted?
So I think there are two tensions here. The first one you pointed out, voluntary versus mandatory. And I think if you're really a large corporation, you should not have the choice. So you can't have a multiplicity. And I think if you're inside a corporation, the challenge you face today is these multiple proliferation of regulatory initiatives, right? So one is reasonable enough to ask, how much is too much? And linked with this, I think I've got a problem with purely industry-led initiatives. And we've got a couple of these big ones in the climate space and in other social related disclosures. We've had one spectacular blowout recently with an industry-led initiative where some of these climate targets were seen to be diluted. So I think purely industry-led initiatives had a space, I think, 5-10 years ago. Right now, we've got to grandfather all of this into global goals that the regulatory community really needs to come together. I mean, there's nothing wrong with industry originating ideas. But, we've learned before the global financial crisis that we just can't leave regulation purely in industry's hands. At that time, that is, of course, a recipe for disaster. So I think if you ask a large-sized corporation operating in multiple jurisdictions today, how do we make ESG better? They're likely to say reduce regulatory complexity. Let's have greater standardization. Let's all operate and disclose the same set of metrics so there's better comparability. And I think the investors have a very critical role to play here. They've played a critical role in my view. Obviously, investors come at this from their own vantage point, right? So they're not going to be on the side of regulators on all issues. But I think one can reasonably say that we would not have had greater climate disclosure today if it hadn't been the intervention of investors. So I think everyone has a role to play. But I'm really surprised that the regulatory community think it's okay to let some of these industry-led initiatives to proliferate.
One of the things that we have learned is that they become useful, effective, only when all parties are part of either its formation or the governance structure. My final question is this, we are talking about the business and human rights bubble or the business and human rights community, which is sort of at a tangent or slightly removed from the main ESG investing community. Given the backlash, what sort of collaboration do you see happening between them?
One that I think is really important is just recognizing that within the last maybe 10 years is, a lot of grassroots groups, and those are human rights groups, they're human rights defenders, they're environmentalists, they're a range of organizations that are striving to either protect their communities from abuses, from corporate misuse of land, resources, and obviously creating a situation where rights holders don't feel empowered whatsoever, to a kind of a concept where, and this is what we've been working on for a long time, really, but especially now focused on the power shifting. As we've worked so much in the global supply chain, you can get little changes within a factory, but if you don't have the sharing of power, shared responsibility, it doesn't work. And I was thinking of that when you're describing the multi-stakeholder initiative, Salil, building on what you said, Vasuki, about industry. You can only go so far unless you have some standard regulation and all stakeholders there. What we've experienced is that too often the rights holders, the workers, the communities, the environmentalists that are trying to protect people and planet really don't have a lot of power. So they've been reaching out to investors to recognizing that investors could be a kind of leverage for some of their issues with some of the big companies. And that's been very fruitful because we have learned a lot from, the folk on the ground and why it's so important. And maybe it's where I started in my career working with the United Farm Workers. It was the workers that made the decisions about what the strategies were. Too often now with the supply chains, the large retailers, brands, as they negotiate, in my experience, is often the negotiation year on year is to cut the price. And that's pretty much it. It's price, quality, delivery, etc. Now getting into that kind of a shared responsibility, and there's a responsible contracting project that is mentioned in the new legislation at the corporate sustainability due diligence level, trying to get the whole issue of power out in the open so that it's not just the supplier that's going to do A, B, and C with less price, and all these demands come from the buyer and not sharing that responsibility. There are lots of examples of that. But I do think that these kind of moments where you have, on the one hand, anti-ESG could be a distraction. It can help, activate, motivate broader thinking and coalitions that can actually do what really needs doing on the environmental side and on the people side.
I just want to end on a more hopeful note. I was reflecting a little bit on India's shock election outcome this week, which I see as a major ESG victory. It'll not be seen as that.
Yeah.
And really, this speaks to the power of the ballot box, the power of the street, where people looked at the government's track record and essentially decided that the ESG proposition was not working, right? So you've got environmental degradation happening in India on a massive scale. You've had problems with record high temperatures where the mitigation has been deficient. On the social side, of course, extremely well known what the government stance has been towards minorities, towards other disadvantaged groups. And, the voters essentially saw misgovernance, not only on the part of the government, but also in the fact that crony capitalism appeared to be getting a clear pass.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I think, if you bring this all together, I think ESG has a space in public discourse, in public impact. And obviously the devil will always be in the details. So if we follow an evidence-based framework and not only place emphasis on the investor class and the corporate sector, but bring in other actors, I think ultimately in a democracy, if you get ejected out of power, it is one of these ES and G factors which are going to make a difference.
That's a great point. I think at some point we also want to make sure that the angel is in the details as well.
Yeah. Yes. Absolutely. David, you should say that, of course. But I just have to take two final takeaways, reinforcing both what you have been saying. And Vasuki, in your case, because you called it evidence-based and not numbers-based, because if you went by numbers-based, the outcome could have been different in the Indian context by looking at just the GDP figures. But the fact that we need to look beyond that, and I think that's the point you're making, which is good. And David, in your case, you mentioned right early on the power of listening. And, obviously, people listen to voters in India only once every 5 years. But boy, when they speak, what happens? Now we know.
That's right. That's right.
So
exactly.
That's a very hopeful note to end on. Thank you so much, both of you. Thank you.
It's fascinating to hear that comparison between what's happening in India and your discussion on ESG here, Salil. What are your important takeaways for businesses on this subject?
Well, it is a business notion, ESG. So I really like the way Vasuki characterized and tried to understand politics through that prism, which was quite illuminating. But I think there are 2 or 3 things we need to understand here. One is that ESG is a way in which companies want to measure performance. And every time you want to measure performance, you need data which is comparable. And one of the problems with data is that it's often not comparable. And there's an old axiom, right? That what you can measure may not matter, and what really matters cannot be measured. And I think that's one of the problems, that E part of it, the environmental part, it's sometimes easy to measure. The G is also quite often easy to measure, whether your policy is in place for governance. It's the social part that becomes hard to measure. And I think companies are still struggling with it. There is no global framework agreeing to that. There are more and more sustainability indices on stock markets which try to measure corporate performance, but we don't have a global framework and common understanding of what it is that is being measured and how markets are reward them and what incentives and disincentives are being built in them. And the third part is that because of that ambiguity and because certain people think that markets are supreme, there is a political backlash. And it's not just against ESG, It's also again the diversity, equity, and inclusion agendas in corporation, what they describe as woke capitalism. And it's an unfortunate development. The good news, however, is that large investors and large companies realize the value of it because regulators want it, consumers want it, investors want it, prospective recruitees want it, and current staff wants it. So there are lots of people who want it, and I think it's going to be an interesting contest to watch.
Now, we couldn't have a conversation with David without asking him a little more about his life and experiences. In his 80 years, he has met Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and worked with people like Archbishop Desmond Tutu.
That's quite right. So when I asked David to tell me a little bit more about where his passion and drive came from, these were the names he was willing to talk about.
I think in part, I was really fortunate to have a family, parents that were engaged and involved. My father, a United Methodist clergy, my mother, a teacher, and a social justice, racial justice activist. So growing up in small town Wisconsin, it never felt like a small town. So I was always looking at what my parents were doing, and especially my mother was getting involved with civil rights, the civil rights movement. So when I went to Carroll College in Wisconsin, that was fairly, what I would say, good faculty, very homogeneous student body, white middle class, suburban, Milwaukee, Chicago. So I went through the American University in Beirut, Lebanon. And there I met so many people that became the shapers of my life from there. I discovered the Vietnam War. This was 1964-65. I met Malcolm X, and I was in the front row, and I was a Martin Luther King follower. But here was Malcolm X. He'd left the Nation of Islam. He'd just gone to the Hajj, came to Beirut, and I was very skeptical because of the U.S. press always focused on, he's the violent one. Martin Luther King is the real way to go. But he was so compelling. What I remember so clearly was he had started this campaign, starting with some African leaders and others that he had gone to before and after the Hajj, to come to the UN with a proposal that looking at U.S. racism as a human rights violation. And so I was so taken by him, partly because he was so intelligent, but he was talking about coalitions. And when I went up and shook his hand, I just said, essentially, that you had converted me, if you will. But it was very important to get that sort of balance. Later in his book, The Autobiography of Malcolm X, if you look at, page 350, there's a description of that incident, not by name, but that he had recognized that there were several Americans in the front that had really come in very suspicious, hostile, and I won them over. But to really get at some of the issues through people that were hugely making a difference.
Can you tell me how the ICCR itself started and how you became so focused on the role of investors?
In 1966, a student at Union Seminary in Columbia, Tim Smith from Toronto, who was a classmate, first-year classmate, and he had done a lot of research around South Africa and apartheid South Africa, started a small group. So all of a sudden, we were in a campaign to get our board to take its money out of First National City Bank because two students at Union, who were a part of this International Fellows Program at Columbia, had found that right after Sharpeville massacre in March of 1960, 11 banks formed a consortium and began to give direct loans to the South African government. So we went down to what was then First National City, leafleted in front. That was the beginning of work on South Africa, and that morphed by 1970 into a kind of movement where it ended up in 1971, in May, the formation of the Interfaith Centre on Corporate Responsibility. And of course, it took a lot of time, energy, and effort for 20 years. This young minister contacted ICCR in 1971 and said, utilize your shares in the companies to leverage them to leave South Africa until apartheid is dismantled. And that, of course, became Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who was a mentor all the way through the years until he died year and a half, 2 years ago. So it's important to do the research and know what the issues are, but to really be engaging people that are either experiencing them, like so many in South Africa, who we didn't have the right to say, let's get our companies to withdraw. It was South Africans, of course. So I learned through that. And then in 1970, working with Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta as a local United Methodist minister in California, building Northern California support for the United Farm Workers organizing. And at that point, Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, who had started the union in 1962, had convinced 30 million people in the U.S. to stop purchasing California table grapes that were non-union. And so that became a global issue. But I think there was seeing Cesar and Dolores, how they interacted with workers and how they made it so clear that if anyone was going to interact with the union, it was they who would be setting up the strategies. It wouldn't be us saying, well, we think you should be doing this or that. So as a result, we ended up building interfaith organizations in Northern California and Southern California to support the strategies of the farm workers. And that was just pivotal. And I think as I got involved more and more with companies, first, when we were working with Cesar and Dolores, we were going to Safeway, we were going to Lucky, some of the big food companies in California, to talk about why it's important to have California table grapes that are unionized, that are picked by union workers. So at any rate, then it, of course, I think in part was the whole concept that in 1971, that finance matters, that investors matter. And too often, unless there's a real sort of process of engagement, it can easily be on either unknowingly or unwilling on the wrong side. So when we looked in 1969-70 about all the issues related to Vietnam and the companies that were making napalm, et cetera, we found that a lot of the faith-based organizations, Protestants, et cetera, were investing in companies that their social principles would have essentially said, we should not be doing this, it's immoral, et cetera. So I think that's where we started in 1971, and it took 20 years. And of course, what we were doing was so small compared to when you look at the Youth of Soweto, and then you look at international sanctions, the UN, et cetera, that over time. But we were in the early 70s, pretty early, in trying to get universities to look at the issue, et cetera. So to me, finance is all about moral values and what you are doing with what you have in terms of investing. And you have some options there, not that you can control everything. However, if you have basic principles, like the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and then the development of the UN Principles on Responsible Investment at the UN, there's the whole range of things going on now. But I do feel like there's this core understanding that, we're always wanting companies to be more responsible and to adopt human rights and labor and environmental standards. Investors need to do the same thing.
It's been really amazing to hear about the life and work of David Schilling. Thank you to David, Vasuki and Salil for that fascinating discussion on ESG too. Thank you for listening to this episode of Voices, which is brought to you from the Institute for Human Rights in Business. Until next time, be sure to share and follow this podcast, that way you will never miss an episode. And if you'd like to find out more about the work that we do at IHRB, then head to ihrb.org.